Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Well, the hue and cry, the battle cry was when these tariff troubles started some months ago, buy Canadian. Let's just do what we need to do to promote Canadian businesses, Canadian economy, and just kind of thumb our nose at what was going on south of the border. Well, here we are about 5-6 months into this right now. Are you still doing that? Or are you finding it more and more difficult? Is your interest waning? Or is the deck stacked against us? There's a lot of questions here, but I'm just trying to notice a lot of this stuff anecdotal over the last little while about strong opinions about, Canadian goods and trying to bolster the Canadian economy, because we felt like, well, we were being punished by the Trump administration. And there's a lot of stuff here in this country that maybe we hadn't paid attention to in the past that we should be focusing on and try to promote Canadian businesses. Great idea, right? And initially I thought there was a real buy-in to that, and maybe there still is. Maybe we're just not talking about it as much. But I see that there seems to be some cracks in that resolve, I think, that we had a few months ago. A couple of ways to look at this. First of all, where we spend our money, geographically where we spend it, and how we spend it, I guess, are two of the big factors here. Where we spend it, well, we talked about not going to the United States anymore. Stop trying to promote their economy. And that worked, and it's had a negative impact on American businesses. As we've seen and reported on this podcast, an awful lot of American representatives at all three state level, municipal level, and federal level have been imploring Canadians, please come back across the border. We need your money. I mean, they rely on tourism and Canadians to have an impact, and it just hasn't been happening to the same degree it has in past years. We've talked about, in our situation, I mean, we love to go down to New York City. We love live theater. We love Broadway. And every couple of years, we'd spend a few days down there, go see some plays, and it was wonderful. Been to other great American cities like Boston, Chicago, too. That's off the map. We're not even doing that. No way. Forget it, not happening. And I know other people that has made those same decisions. And I know that some of the border towns, Niagara Falls, the Detroit-Windsor area, certainly out west, Vancouver, down through Seattle and places like that, are basically saying they've seen an impact. As a matter of fact, places like Las Vegas have seen a huge drop in tourism dollars. Now, I'm not saying it's exclusively Canadians not going down there, but you got to know that's a factor. So to that extent, yes, it is working, and they have been complaining to their representatives, including in Washington, to say, look, you got to do something about this. Well, when that happened under the first Trump administration, the government then responded and said, okay, let's try to find a deal here. And, the tariffs and counter tariffs, and it was hurting American businesses. And they said, okay, let's call a truce here and find some resolution, which we did. Well, that was an interim solution. Well, here we are, second Trump administration. The main factor that seems to be different now is I don't think Trump's paying attention. When people from Kentucky or from Nevada or from some of the border states like Maine and Ohio and Michigan start saying, look, we need Canadian tourism back, they seem oblivious to that because Trump is focused on, Trump and his billionaire buddies as opposed to what's going on in small town America or with some of these tourism dollars. And that's a major factor here. If he doesn't care, if he's not listening to that, I'm more concerned about the Dow Jones and NASDAQ than he is about, what's happening in places like the Western New York. That's going to be a problem. So that's part of it. The other thing is people, I guess, I don't know if they're losing their resolve, but I used the example a couple of weeks ago, watching the Blue Jays play, when they go on the road in places like Detroit and other places, you always see a huge number of Blue Jay fans. And now some of them might be local, but I know that it's summertime. And an awful lot of Canadians will get in the car and plan a trip. I had one buddy of mine, a radio buddy of mine years ago, that every year he and 3 or 4 of his buddies would hop in the car and they'd plan a trip down around baseball cities. They'd go to Chicago, they'd go to Cincinnati, wherever, and catch ball games in 4 or 5 different places, 4 or 5 different stadia. And it was a great holiday for them. I don't know if they're still doing that, but I know some people are. But first I thought, hey, come on, people. I thought, this was all about Buy Canada. You shouldn't be doing that. But I get it. If you've got young kids and, you want to go see a Blue Jay game in Chicago or Detroit, certainly, because I know there's always people who go across the border. It's problematic, but it's still happening. And of course, the Jays are hot this year. So, maybe you might have thought, no, we're not going to do it. But then you kind of thought, well, you know what? They are winning. And you want to go see the guys play. And it's summertime. And we should want to take the kids over for the border. And so I get that. I'm not crazy about it, but I'm not going to sit here and wag my finger and say you guys shouldn't be doing that. I don't think they should. But, it's their choice to do that sort of thing. But it's not as if they're making a huge impact on the economy. But if more and more people stop doing that, if you started seeing empty seats in some of those buildings, then maybe there'd be a greater pressure on the American politicians to try to do something about it. But that's the cross-border stuff. And it is working, and it has worked. And we know, for instance, that the alcohol industry, especially down in some of the southern states, is hurting. And it's because of the loss of Canadian businesses, which kind of circles back to what the other element is how we're spending our money. In Ontario, for instance, we still, even though there seems to be a relief of some of the counter tariffs that we instilled some months ago, Doug Ford here in Ontario said there's no plan for them to start bringing American alcohol and beer and wine back into LCBO stores. He says that's until the tariffs on steel and aluminum and things like that are dealt with, he's not going to do that. So they're making the decision for us. And I said, that's hurting an awful lot of people. But we made choices. Bourbon, I like, but there's some American wines, some California wines especially, that we like. I can live without it because we're making a political statement here. So, you learn to improvise and think, okay, fine, let's try this wine instead. Let's try this spirit instead. Beer's a different story. I know some people that love American beer. More and more people I know, and including in our household, if we're going to have a beer right now, invariably we tend to go to one of the craft breweries locally, as opposed to some of the national or international brands, really. So that's not really hurting an awful lot of people. But again, it's a conscious decision by we as consumers to do that sort of thing. Other products, well, that's one of the things I'm really getting pissed off about. I mean, I was in the grocery store the other day, and I am notorious, by the way, for not shopping, okay? When my wife says, okay, we need to go and buy such and such, I just go and buy it. Go down to this store, that aisle, okay? There's the rice, there's the TP or whatever it is we're going to buy. I don't look at the price. I just say, okay, I've got it. Now let's get in the car and go. But now I'm paying attention to that, not necessarily price, but where it's from. I do read the labels, and it really ticked me off a couple of days ago. I like grapes. And seedless grapes. And, summertime, they're great, as a snack. And back in the early part of the springtime, that was easy. There were grapes from Mexico. There were grapes from Argentina. And so I figured, okay, I can do that. Well, you go to a produce department, especially, I think there's about 4 grocery stores within a short drive of our house, and all of them are selling nothing but U.S. produce. And I'm not going to buy it. That's all there is to it. I'm not going to buy their grapes. I'm not going to buy their tomatoes, especially now because the stuff we grow some of that stuff here in Ontario and in Canada. We should be using that. And I'm not going to yell at the guy in the produce section at the grocery store for that. He doesn't make that decision. That's done way up the corporate ladder. But I thought these guys were on our side. And maybe that was naive because these are the same grocery stores, of course, that ripped us off and were convicted, of course, of price fixing when it came to things like bread. And you and I both know that even though, there have been other products that we've suspected, and they say, oh, no, there's nothing going on. You know that these guys are basically jacking prices up. They've done that for years now, and governments are hesitant to do anything about that. And we're getting nicked by it. So maybe I shouldn't be surprised that these guys are simply saying, yeah, buy the U.S. stuff, and if you don't like it, too bad, so sad, just don't buy grapes or don't buy this or buy that. But that just makes it even more, I think, important for we as consumers to do a little homework. And all you need to do is read the label. And we talked about some of the chicanery that was going on with the grocery stores. They were putting Canadian labels on stuff that wasn't Canadian. Or they were saying, shipped from Canada. Well, yeah, it was probably built in Kentucky, but then they moved it up here and it was shipped from some full warehouse here into there. We need to be diligent about this and do our homework on this stuff because it does have an impact. We are not naive about this. We've talked about this in the podcast. The Prime Minister's talked about this when he's talked about this Buy Canadian aspect. We're not going to bring the U.S. economy to its knees. That's simply not going to happen. We don't have the wherewithal to do that, but we can have an impact on certain sectors of it. And everybody can do their part. So I guess the message here, the takeaway here is you got to stay the course here. We got to stay with this. The Buy Canadian aspect is important. And of course, one of the huge advantages of it is it promotes the Canadian businesses themselves. Maybe you didn't think about where that product was made before. You just liked such and such. Now you can say, hey, there is a Canadian alternative. Let's try that. And you may change your buying habits as a result of that. And of course, that promotes businesses here too. because we are facing some cheap goods coming from some other places. We've got to be very, very cautious about exactly where we're spending our money these days, because it will have an impact. And you're playing your role and doing our part to try to do something and have an impact on what's happening here. You want our guys at the top there, the negotiators in Washington and the other elected officials. They've got their job to do, and they're going back and forth, and they're talking with the politicians down there. But we can do this way down here at the grassroots level too. Stay with it. It does work, and it does send a message, and at the same time, it helps promote the Canadian businesses. So it's a win-win-win as far as we're concerned. So buy Canadian. Keep it up. All right. Stay strong. It's I mentioned before, this is a marathon, not a sprint, and we need to be diligent. We have to stay the course here. So, check those grapes like I had to do. And if you don't find what you want, well, don't buy the grapes. Find an alternative. Now I'm a discerning shopper, and I never thought I'd get to that stage, but I think a lot of Canadians are doing the same thing. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks so much for being with us. Wherever you get your podcasts, on whichever platform. And so many of you have jumped on side in the last little while. We really do appreciate that. Thank you so much. If you're on YouTube, by the way, welcome. Don't forget to hit that notification bell to spread the word on that. And by the way, check the podcast descriptions when you join us too, because we always have some further reading about some of the topics that we're going into here. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. The number of new people coming on side with the podcast is fabulous. But there's a lot more work to do, and by subscribing, well, you'll help us to grow and support the work that we're doing here on the podcast. Thanks to Madeline Kelly for producing and getting this one together for us, and as always, we'll see you soon, okay? I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.